Global audience. President Donald Trump addresses the United Nations. High on his list, threats from Iran and China, and protecting the unborn. We have a report and reaction. Increasing pressure. 7 Democratic lawmakers say they might support the start of impeachment proceedings against the president. We're on Capitol Hill. Christian witness. Pope Francis meets with the Vatican Department of Communication, including EWTN CEO and chairman of the board. We'll talk to Michael Warsaw from Rome. And Catholics and climate change, an analysis of what the church teaches on a global issue making headlines. On EWTN News Nightly for Tuesday, September 24th, 2019. Good evening from Washington, D.C., and thank you for joining us for news from a Catholic perspective. I'm Wyatt Goolsby. President Donald Trump stands up for unborn babies during a wide-ranging speech at the United Nations. He rejects the push for taxpayer-funded abortions. The president also called out immigration advocates and blasted social media companies which try to silence conservatives. United Nations correspondent Sabrina Ferrisi reports from New York City. Good evening, Sabrina.
Good evening, Wyatt. Here at the United Nations General Assembly, President Trump called for all nations to allow religious freedom, and he identified pressing international problems. But he really caught our attention when he argued against abortion on the world stage.
Americans will also never tire of defending innocent life.
Speaking to world leaders, President Trump accused the United Nations of trying to assert a global right to taxpayer-funded abortion on demand.
Global bureaucrats have absolutely no business attacking the sovereignty of nations that wish to protect innocent life.
The president also criticized social justice agencies who promote immigration policies that he says lead to human smuggling.
Today I have a message for those open border activists who cloak themselves in the rhetoric of social justice. Your policies are not just. Your policies are cruel and evil.
And the president sounded the alarm against giant social media companies. Republicans have accused Facebook and Twitter of blocking conservative voices. President Trump says he will uphold free speech.
A free society cannot allow social media giants to silence the voices of the people.
The president also repeated his call for other nations to stop criminalizing homosexuality.
And we stand in solidarity with LGBTQ people who live in countries that punish, jail, or execute individuals based upon sexual orientation.
And he said America is committed to protecting religious freedom.
Hard to believe, but 80% of the world's population lives in countries where religious liberty is in significant danger.
The president says America will never stop defending freedom of worship and religion.
President Trump was not silent on international threats. He says Iran and North Korea must give up their nuclear desires. He also condemned Venezuela and Cuba and says the days of unfair trade with China are over. Wyatt?
United Nations correspondent Sabrina Ferrisi reporting from New York City. Thanks, Sabrina. Before the president's speech at the UN, the Trump administration insisted abortion is not an international human right. Administration officials are joining other countries to demand changes be made in the United Nations documents that promote abortion. White House correspondent Mark Irons reports. Good evening, Mark.
Good evening, Wyatt. The Trump administration, joined by a coalition of countries, are calling for more clarity. They say phrases like sexual health and reproductive rights are ambiguous and there's no consensus about what they actually mean, but they're often used to expand access to abortion around the world.
We in America believe that every child, born and unborn, is a sacred gift from God.
The Trump administration has taken its pro-life message to the United Nations. Prior to President Trump's speech to the General Assembly, Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar spoke on behalf of the U.S. and 18 other countries.
We do not support references to ambiguous terms and expressions, such as sexual and reproductive health and rights in UN documents, because they can undermine the critical role of the family and promote practices like abortion.
Secretary Azar says a phrase like reproductive rights can be used in circumstances that do not enjoy international consensus and which can be misinterpreted by UN agencies.
There is no international right to an abortion, and these terms should not be used to promote pro-abortion policies and measures.
Planned Parenthood Global responds, it should come as no surprise the Trump-Pence administration is lobbying other countries to join them in working to undermine sexual and reproductive rights on a global scale. Meanwhile, the pro-life group World Youth Alliance tells News Nightly, improving health care is an important goal, but one often undercut by the promotion of abortion, contraceptives, and sexuality education. As Secretary Azar noted, these are not rights and have never been accepted by consensus or in other documents at the UN.
I did hear from a pro-life diplomat at the United Nations who is expressing some concern in addition to praise for this. The concern comes from the fact that some of the countries that signed on to this initiative, some of the places like Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, don't respect basic human rights. And this pro-life diplomat told me it was foolish for the U.S. to sign on to this with those types of countries. Wyatt.
And we'll have more analysis of this pro-life push coming up a little bit later in the newscast. White House correspondent Mark Irons reporting. Thanks, Mark. President Trump says he'll release a transcript of controversial call with Ukraine's president. More and more Democrats have urged an impeachment probe because of that call. The president faces allegations he pressured Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden's son. And the president faces questions about freezing nearly $400 million in aid to Ukraine before that call. Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi has more. Jason?
Why Democrats huddle right now to talk about impeaching the president. Up until now, Speaker Pelosi has urged restraint, worried about backlash as well as protecting her majority. Democrats won that majority in 2018 by flipping moderate districts. Now Pelosi says they're in a different place. President Trump accuses the Democrats of playing politics.
It's a witch hunt. I'm leading in the polls. They have no idea how they stop me. The only way they can try is through impeachment.
Calls for impeachment are getting louder. 7 new House Democrats write in the Washington Post, if these allegations are true, we believe these actions represent an impeachable offense. That possible offense, the allegation President Trump pressured Ukraine to investigate Joe Biden's son. Number 2 Senate Democrat Dick Durbin says it's grounds for an impeachment investigation.
That no president, not this president, no president, can solicit or strong-arm a foreign country to further his own campaign. That is unacceptable under the Constitution of the United States, which I remind my colleagues we have sworn to uphold and defend.
President Trump says he did nothing wrong in his July 25th call with Ukraine's president.
There was no pressure put on them whatsoever, but there was pressure put on with respect to Joe Biden. What Joe Biden did for his son, that's something they should be looking at.
Hunter Biden served on the board of a Ukrainian gas company. Today, Republican John Kennedy says Congress should investigate both the president's phone call and Biden.
But does anybody really believe that this Ukraine oligarch got Hunter Biden's name off ZipRecruiter to put him on his board of directors, to pay him $50,000 a month, and to give bucket loads of money to his law firm? I mean, come on.
The House Intelligence Chairman says the whistleblower regarding this phone call does want to share her story with Congress. Adam Schiff says that whistleblower could testify as early as this week. Wyatt?
Capitol Hill correspondent Jason Calvi reporting. Thanks, Jason. Britain's highest court says Prime Minister Boris Johnson acted illegally when he suspended Parliament earlier this month.
This court has already concluded that the Prime Minister's advice to Her Majesty was unlawful, void, and of no effect. This means that the order in council to which it led was also unlawful, void, and of no effect, and should be quashed.
Johnson says he strongly disagrees with the decision, but says he respects the court. He might try to suspend the governing body again. The Prime Minister was in New York for the United Nations meetings. He wants Britain to leave the European Union with or without a deal by October 31st. Israel's main political parties began talks today on forming a coalition government. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, shown on the right, and Benny Gantz on the left, are trying to solve the political standstill following last week's deadlocked national elections. The failure to solve the crisis could lead to a third election. Pope Francis hosts a meeting with members of the Vatican Department of Communication. His message? be Christian witnesses to the truth. 500 members of the Dicastery of Communication were present yesterday. It's a division of the Roman Curia overseeing all the communication offices of the Holy See and the Vatican. Also present are CEO and Chairman of the Board of EWTN, Michael Warsaw, who is a consultant to the Vatican Department. And now we're joined by Michael Warsaw from Rome to tell us about the day's events. Michael, what was the Holy Father's message to the group?
Well, the Holy Father, of course, tossed away his prepared text and spoke extemporaneously to the group. And in that message, he really cautioned that, Catholic communications and our work of communicating the gospel should always be true, should always be about communicating the beauty, the truth, the goodness of the faith, and that our efforts should always be about preaching the gospel. In fact, he used the phrase that's sometimes attributed to St. Francis, preach the gospel always, and when necessary, use words. So the Holy Father's message was really one that encouraged everyone present who was involved in the Vatican's efforts at communications to really be authentic in preaching the gospel as part of their work.
EWTN is the largest religious media network in the world. Tell us about your role as a consultant to the Vatican Department of Communication.
Sure. Well, consultors come from around the world, so there's a small group of consultors representing nearly every region of the world. There are cardinal members of the dicastery, there are bishops, archbishops from various parts of the world, and then lay consultors primarily. And our role is really to advise the Holy See on its communications efforts, on its policies, on its approaches, and really the organization of its communications efforts. Basically, to use the experience that each of us brings to the table from our own works, our own apostolic works, and to guide the Holy See's efforts going forward so that they can be the most effective.
Today, an EWTN film on Mother Cabrini was screened for the first time in Italian in Italy's House of Representatives. Mother Cabrini was an Italian-American sister and the first naturalized citizen of the United States to be canonized. What was the reaction to the film?
It was incredibly positive and certainly was wonderful to be able to be present there. The film was introduced by the president of the Chamber of Deputies there in the Italian Parliament. And it was really a great event leading up to the Church's celebration of World Day of Migrants, which will be celebrated this coming Sunday. And so much was discussed prior to the screening of the film regarding really Mother Cabrini as the patron saint of migrants, all of the things that she suffered and went through in her life to accomplish God's work. And the film is certainly a fitting tribute in a way of sharing that great work of Mother Cabrini with the world.
So many interesting things happening today and this week in Rome. And of course, we're happy to hear about it directly from you, Michael Warsaw, EWTN Chairman of the Board and CEO. Thanks so much for joining us.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Coming up, analysis of President Trump's remarks to the United Nations. As we told you earlier in the show, President Donald Trump discussed the threats from Iran, China, as well as the fight for the unborn during his speech at the United Nations. Joining us now for analysis is Steve Yates, the CEO of DC International Advisory and a former Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. Steve, welcome in. The President and his administration are highlighting their pro-life policies at the UN, as you heard. Are there any indications their push is going to work or have any effect on other countries?
Well, we certainly are not going to have an effect if we don't raise the issues and push it. I think it's very, very welcome to have a leader of the United States go to the United Nations and unabashedly, unashamedly talk straight from American values and interests. Too often we've had our diplomats kind of go represent the world to the United States instead of the United States going to the world, recognizing maybe not everyone will agree or follow, but we can speak up. And if the United States speaks up, it creates room for those who agree around the world to step in.
Such an important issue. The President also addressed the threat from Iran. He says, quote, I want to get this right, no responsible government should subsidize Iran's bloodlust. Pretty strong words. What did you make of his comments?
Well, accurate, to the point, things that we've kind of come to expect from the president. He's not sort of shading the edges on it. The theocrats in Iran have been at war with the United States since 1979. They've been responsible for all the provocations in this region that have affected American lives and interests for decades. And so it's actually true. The Europeans, some of our allies in the region and elsewhere, have too often either given aid comfort, sanctions evasion, or direct subsidization of the evil acts of the Islamic Republic.
United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres says he is concerned about the trade conflict between the United States and China, the world's two largest economies. Will the president's speech have any effect, good or bad, on the U.S.-Beijing trade war?
Well, I think it helped educate some of the people who cared to listen. I don't know how many people go to the UN General Assembly with their ears open. A lot of them go with their mouths open. Mm-hmm. And so if they've come to listen, they might hear a little bit about how the president thinks and what his aims and objectives are. He clearly is squarely on the side of the American people on this and what our interests are. And I think a lot of people in other countries feel the same way about their nations needing to rebalance trade relations with China too. I think that's why China feels some pressure, and probably it's important for the president to step forward and acknowledge the tension, the elephant in the room, so to speak, because I don't think it's a short-term phenomenon. This is a long-term adjustment.
What else does the Trump administration need to do to resolve this trade war with China? Such a big issue.
It's an enormous issue. Number one, I think they have to have resolve and patience. The president has made clear he's willing to meet almost any time with the leaders of China to talk through what's necessary, but he's not going to concede on the issues where the Chinese have gotten an unfair advantage at our expense. And so it's going to take some will. Probably is going to have to grind through a re-election campaign before the Chinese see that they can't just wait him out. And I think that with the endorsement of the voters, the Chinese are going to have to make a deal that allows their economy to go back to growth.
Okay, so we mentioned the issue of pro-life, we mentioned Iran, China. This was President Trump's third address to the UN. Was there anything different about his tone or themes this year that you picked up on?
I think the most striking thing is he's clearly a president that is now much more comfortable in his skin getting up in front of this kind of an audience. So he's more comfortable boiling down what are his core issues and themes he wants to push across. He doesn't really need to worry about someone throwing a shoe or catcalling from the gallery, as kind of was the case early on in his tenure. And so I think that there have been some accomplishments people see. When he's talking about rebalancing alliances, he's not disengaging from the world. He's not leaving a vacuum. He's just changing the priorities and approach to our engagement. I think that's refreshing and was somewhat overdue. Maybe a few more nations at the United Nations have come to see it too.
Like I say, so many important issues here being covered just this week at the United Nations. Steve Yates, CEO of DC International Advisory and former Deputy National Security Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney, thanks so much for your analysis.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Up next, what the church does and does not teach about climate change. The Vatican says a Jesuit high school in Indiana that refused to fire a teacher in a same-sex relationship can resume all student masses while its appeal is heard. Over the summer, a local archbishop revoked the Catholic status of Brabuff Prep in Indianapolis. The archdiocese says the Holy See's decision is common and does not affect the outcome of the appeal. Pope Francis appeals to world leaders to take action on climate change.
Saludo a los participantes en la cumbre sobre la acción climática.
In a video message delivered yesterday to the United Nations Climate Action Summit, the Holy Father called the issue, quote, one of the principal challenges we have to face. Here to take a look at the environment from a Catholic perspective is Father Thomas Petri, moral theologian and professor at the Dominican House of Studies in Washington, D.C. He's also co-host of The Church Alive, Saturday mornings on EWTN Radio. Father, welcome back to the program. In this video address, Pope Francis said, quote, the problem of climate change is related to issues of ethics, equity, and social justice. Pretty all-encompassing. So then how should we as Catholics think about this topic?
I think so often we see climate change talked about in the news as though the earth is some sort of deity that we have to reverence and respect. That's not the church's understanding. We certainly have to reverence and respect creation because it's a gift from God and we are its stewards. Pope Francis, like Pope Benedict XVI before him, sees the environment as intrinsically connected to how we live our lives, not only as individuals, but with each other. So if you have a country that is harvesting resources from developing countries, it can make the standard of living in those countries less, and it can impact ethics, it can impact justice, and even the quality of life for other people.
So it starts with an awareness of all of that situation. And then, of course, the Holy Father addressed climate change in his 2015 papal encyclical called Laudato Si, which means on care for our common home. How has that letter influenced the global discussion on then taking action?
I wish it would influence it much more. Unfortunately, Laudato Si was interpreted to be primarily about caring for the planet, on our common home. But when you read Laudato Si, it really is about the human person in the environment. What role does the human person have, both in our relationships with each other and our relationships with the environment? If the environment is flourishing for everybody, we all will flourish. And so in Laudato Si, the Holy Father unites concern for the environment, or a lack of concern, with also a lack of concern for individuals. He talks about the throwaway culture. He talks about abortion. He talks about just an inability to recognize the other, whether it's my neighbor down the street, whether it's somebody who's living in Africa who helps to build things that I purchase, at the store. How is our economy, how is our way of life here affecting others who live elsewhere in this home that we call planet Earth?
And this may be connected to that, but the Holy Father and other church leaders have used this phrase, integral ecology. Tell us what that means.
Well, Pope Benedict XVI coined that, actually. In Caritas in Veritate, his very last encyclical, he began to talk about an integral ecology, a human ecology. And so that to put the questions of environment and climate within the context of human communities and what the climate and what our concerns about the environment say about our priorities with regard to ourselves and with regard to others.
When you think about those issues when it comes to climate change, some scientists believe we'll see more deadly storms as a result of all of this, storms that lead to people being dislocated. So then what do you think we as Catholics can do to preserve human dignity of all of those vulnerable people?
I think it's what we should do whenever we come across people who are in difficult situations. We shouldn't rely on some organization elsewhere to handle these things. That we are responsible as Christians to interact with those who are in our circles, who are in our neighborhoods, in our towns, in our cities, who need help. And we should do our best to help them as best we can. And not to rely on donations and giving money to some bureaucracy just to keep it out of our backyard. We will always have people in our lives and in our communities who need help, and we have to help them.
Pope Francis talked about ensuring a better life for future generations. As we consider solutions, we as Catholics, what should we keep in mind as we think about this big picture?
Well, I always like to defer to scientists and policy experts on those things, but I think one thing we should always consider is that the earth is our home. It was given to us by God for the flourishing of the human race, but that means we also have to take care of it. It means we also have to preserve it for those who are living elsewhere, but also for future generations, as Pope Francis has said. And so we must always have policies that are geared to protecting the common good, protecting human beings, protecting the vulnerable, but also that don't exploit resources and don't exploit the earth.
Some important values and obviously challenges for all of us as well. Father Thomas Petri, moral theologian and professor at the Dominican House of Studies, co-host of the Church Alive Saturday mornings on EWTN Radio. Thanks so much for coming in again.
Thank you.
Finally tonight, before we go, we want to congratulate our producer, Rodney Harris. Rodney proposed to his girlfriend, Colleen, while visiting Disney World. It happened over the weekend, and Colleen said yes. We send our prayers and best wishes to the happy couple. And on that positive note, we wrap up our newscast for tonight. For the entire EWTN News Nightly team, I'm Wyatt Goolsby. We're back tomorrow with more news from a Catholic perspective. Good night, and God bless.